I want you to do something physical for me right now. Wherever you happen to be listening to this deep dive, just reach out and tap something solid.
Yeah, it could be the wood of the desk in front of you.
Right. Or the leather of your steering wheel, or even just pressing your palm flat against a nearby wall. Go ahead, actually do it.
Really feel that, that absolute undeniable resistance pushing back against your skin.
Listen to the dull thud it makes. Because in that exact fraction of a second, your brain registers this binary state of reality.
It tells you there's a definitive, uncrossable border.
Exactly. A border where you end and the world begins. Your hand stops, the desk pushes back, and honestly, it's incredibly comforting.
It really is.
It feels like looking at a clear x-ray of a broken bone in a doctor's office. You see this stark black background.
You see the jagged white line running right through the bone.
Yeah, and the doctor just taps the film with a pen and says, there it is. That is the fracture.
Right. All ambiguity just vanishes.
We crave that kind of diagnostic certainty. I mean, we build our entire psychological framework, our entire conception of reality around a universe neatly categorized into independent subjects and separate objects.
Well, and it makes sense because it's literally the foundation of our evolutionary survival mechanism.
Oh, for sure. Safe, measurable, logical.
Right. Our nervous systems didn't evolve to ponder the metaphysical fluidity of the universe. I mean, they evolved as these highly tuned pattern recognition machines that are they're terrified of ambiguity.
Yeah, if you're navigating a dangerous environment, you need to instantly categorize your surroundings.
Exactly, into discrete, independent objects. You need to know that the predator exists totally independently of the grass.
Right, and that you exist totally independently of the predator.
Yes. We demand a reality that can be conceptually grasped and just locked into a neat, predictable grid.
Because if I'm hesitating, wondering about the fundamental nature of the tiger in the bushes.
You're already lunch.
Exactly, I'm lunch. But today's deep dive is going to take that comfortable, solid reality you just tapped, and we are going to put it under a philosophical microscope.
A very intense microscope.
So intense that those rigid boundaries are going to completely dissolve. We're stepping into the mind of the 2nd century Indian philosopher Nāgārjuna.
Specifically, we're exploring his absolute masterpiece, the Madhyamaka, or the MMK.
And I need to be upfront with you.
Yeah.
We are not just doing a historical survey of abstract theory here.
No, not at all.
We are taking Nāgārjuna's Madhyamaka logic and utilizing it as an active spiritual diagnostic tool. Our mission today is to cure a deeply ingrained cognitive habit.
And that habit is what we call the disease of reification.
The disease of reification, let's unpack that.
So it's our hardwired biological and psychological tendency to take a fluid, deeply interdependent universe and mentally freeze it.
Freeze it into solid, independent, permanent concepts.
Right. We take processes and turn them into things, and we suffer endlessly because we desperately cling to these frozen concepts as if they're absolute reality.
Yeah, and when the frozen concept inevitably melts or changes, we experience profound anxiety and grief.
Exactly. So what Nāgārjuna provides is this profound deconstruction of how our minds manufacture this suffering in the first place.
We're going to map out how our conventional model of reality encompassing consciousness, the phenomena we interact with, causality itself.
Space, time, the irreducible elements of our body, speech, and mind.
Right, how all of it is entirely empty of absolute inherent existence.
But then we're going to take this ultimate deconstructive logic and apply it to the philosophical cure itself.
Which is the big twist. And I have to admit, when I first read through these sources, I thought I was totally misunderstanding the text.
It's a very jarring realization.
It really is. It felt like we were building a lifeboat to escape a sinking ship, only to systematically dismantle the lifeboat while we were sitting in it.
Well, the instinct to feel unnerved by that is exactly what Nāgārjuna anticipated.
Really? He knew we'd freak out.
Oh, definitely. I mean, he establishes the framework of the two truths-dependent origination and emptiness as the ultimate medicine for our suffering.
Right.
But then he actively prevents us from worshiping the medicine. He forces us to analyze the two truths themselves.
To prove that even they are completely empty of inherent existence, he leaves no solid conceptual ground anywhere.
None. Zero.
So why does this matter to you as you go about your day? Because clinging to any absolute concept, even if it's the supposedly enlightened concept of emptiness or liberation,
is the fundamental root of all psychological suffering and frustration.
Exactly. By the time we finish this deep dive, you are going to understand how to completely let go of those concepts.
You'll be left with absolutely nothing to grasp as an inherent solid ground of reality.
And paradoxically, finding that nothingness is the key to total unshakable liberation. Let's start from the ground up, though.
The illusion of solidity.
Yeah, how does our mind actually build this trap in the first place?
It really begins with the fundamental grammar of human cognition.
Okay.
The mind simply cannot process an action or an event without instantly chopping it up into a conceptual triad.
A triad.
Right. We call this the three spheres. Whenever anything happens, your dualistic mind automatically generates an actor, an action, and a result.
It's exactly like sentence structure. Subject, verb, object.
Like the boy threw the ball.
Right, but applied to perception itself.
Yes, and Nāgārjuna identifies these triads everywhere. In the realm of causality, the three spheres are the cause, the act of causing, and the effect.
Okay, so think of a farmer planting a crop. You have the seed, the process of growing, and the eventual sprout.
Exactly. And in the realm of motion, the three spheres are the goer, the act of going, and the destination.
The commuter, the driving, the office building.
Perfect. And in the realm of perception, which is how we interface with reality, the triad is the perceiver, the act of perceiving, and the perceived object.
So the eyeball, the vision, and the desk you just tapped.
That's the one.
I mean, I'm looking at my desk right now, and it's really hard to accept that this is just a cognitive projection.
It feels very real.
It feels completely logical that I am here, the desk is there, and my vision is bridging the gap. That's just the baseline physics of how the universe works, isn't it?
Well, it functions conventionally, yes, but the problem arises when we mistakenly believe these three spheres possess what the Sanskrit texts call svabhava.
Right, savava. That translates to inherent independent existence, doesn't it?
It does. It's the deeply held belief that a thing holds its own reality entirely from its own side, completely cut off from the conditions around it.
Like it's a self-contained little bubble.
Exactly. We assume that the goer exists as a fully formed, independent entity completely prior to and separate from the destination.
Or we assume the seed is inherently, absolutely a seed at its core, entirely separate from the sprout it will eventually become.
Right, we draw these absolute impermeable boundaries around these spheres.
And this is where Nāgārjuna starts dismantling the machinery.
Yeah.
He shows that if you actually assume these things have independent existence, logic completely collapses.
It totally falls apart.
Let's look at the realm of motion, because the argument he makes here, the two motions fallacy, really exposes how absurd our assumptions are.
Oh, the two motions fallacy is brilliant.
So let's say I'm walking down the hallway to the kitchen. My conventional mind says, I am a solid, independent entity. I am the goer, and I am performing an action called walking.
Which feel like two separate, inherently existing things.
Right. But if I am separate from the action, what is the logical problem?
The problem is a mechanical paradox.
A paradox.
Yeah. If the core identity of the goer and the action of the going are completely separate, inherently existing things, you require two distinct emotions to make the scenario work.
Wait, two emotions? How does that work?
You would need one primary metaphysical motion just to give the person the inherent identity of a mover-like to qualify them as the subject before they even take a step. And then you would need a second, completely separate physical motion for the actual act of their feet traversing space down the hallway.
Which implies there's this weird metaphysical, ghostly second mover overlapping with the physical person walking down the hallway.
Exactly. It's logically absurd.
It really is. You cannot separate the goer from the going. You're only a traveler because your legs are moving.
Yes, the act of moving generates the entity who moves. They are entirely dependent on each other.
Because if I stop walking, the goer instantly ceases to exist. I just become a stander.
Right, and that mutual dependence is the exact opposite of svabhava.
Ah, because they rely on each other.
Yes. If the traveler and the traveling depend entirely on each other to exist, neither of them can possess independent, inherent existence. Their existence is borrowed from their relationship.
Let me bring up a counter-argument that Nāgārjuna's historical opponents use, though.
Yeah.
Because it really highlights how desperately we want to protect our sense of a solid self.
They definitely push back.
They really did. When he applied this logic to perception, the perceiver, the perceiving, and the perceived, his opponents drew a line in the sand.
The fire analogy.
Yes. They argued, fine, maybe motion is interdependent, but consciousness definitely has inherent, independent existence. It proves itself just by experiencing.
And that fire analogy was the absolute cornerstone of their defense.
Walk us through it.
So they claim that perception is like a fire burning in a dark room. Fire naturally illuminates external objects like the walls, the floor, the furniture.
Makes sense.
But crucially, fire also illuminates itself. You don't need to shine a flashlight on a fire to see it.
No, obviously not.
Therefore, they argued, consciousness perceives the external world, but it also inherently establishes its own independent existence by perceiving itself.
Without needing an external object to validate it. It sounds like a bulletproof defense. Fire proves itself by simply burning.
It does sound bulletproof until you hear Nāgārjuna's rebuttal.
Right, because he points out a massive flaw in their physics of how light works.
A completely devastating flaw.
He says fire doesn't illuminate itself because fire has never contained darkness in the first place.
It is a phenomenal logical takedown based purely on definitions.
How so?
Illumination is defined exclusively as the act of removing darkness. Since darkness cannot possibly exist within the core nature of fire, fire cannot perform the act of removing darkness from itself.
Wow.
Therefore, it does not illuminate itself, it simply is.
And he takes this logic and applies it everywhere. A blade cannot cut itself.
A fingertip cannot touch its own tip.
And an eyeball cannot look at its own vision without the aid of a mirror. Sight cannot see sight.
Exactly. Therefore, perception cannot exist independently, floating in a void, without an external object to interact with.
You cannot have a perceiver without a perceived object, and you cannot have a perceived object without a perceiver.
They spark into existence simultaneously, relying entirely on each other.
Which brings us to a really severe psychological precipice. I mean, if these fundamental building blocks of our lives, our causality, our motion, our very consciousness, do not exist independently.
Do they exist at all?
Right. If there's no solid seed, no solid goer, no solid perceiver, have we just logically deleted the universe?
It's the ultimate fear.
That is exactly the panic I felt reading this. Are we just free-falling into a dark, meaningless void where nothing matters?
Well, to save us from falling into pure nihilism, that despairing idea that absolutely nothing exists, Nāgārjuna establishes the core framework of his entire philosophy.
The two truths.
Yes, the two truths. This is the setup. This is the ultimate target for the rest of our analysis today. Without the two truths, this entire system just sounds like destructive chaos.
So let's break them down. The first truth is the conventional truth, which is defined as dependent origination.
Right. This truth acknowledges that in the everyday realm, things function flawlessly. The chair holds your weight, the seed grows into a sprout.
The traffic light turns red, and you press the brake pedal.
Exactly. But they function because they depend entirely on a vast web of conditions, causes, and mental imputation.
They exist conventionally, relatively, as a fluid network, not as isolated monads.
And the second truth is the ultimate truth, which is emptiness.
And we have to be incredibly precise with that word.
Oh, absolutely.
To a lot of Western ears, emptiness sounds like a black hole. It sounds like an eraser wiping the chalkboard clean.
And that is the single most dangerous misunderstanding of this philosophy. Emptiness does not mean nothingness.
It's not a dark void.
It is not a dark void or a formless cosmic soup hiding behind the scenes. Emptiness simply means that things lack a fixed, standalone, independent essence.
It's the lack of svabhava.
Yes. Paradoxically, emptiness is precisely the mechanism that allows dependent origination to happen.
I need to visualize this to make it click. So, if the conventional world is a movie playing on a screen, emptiness is not turning off the projector and staring at a blank black wall.
No, not at all.
Emptiness is the realization that the images on the screen are not heavy, solid objects. They are made of light.
Because they are just light, because they're empty of physical mass and inherent identity, they can shift, change, move, and tell a story.
Right. If the image of a car on the screen possessed the actual heavy, solid essence of a real car, the movie would freeze. The screen would literally tear open.
That's a great way to put it.
Emptiness is the necessary breathing room of the universe. If a seed was permanently, inherently, absolutely a seed down to its very core, it could never interact with soil and water.
It can never rupture its own identity to become a sprout.
That captures the mechanics perfectly. Emptiness is the matrix of possibility.
The two truths are in a perfect, inseparable union. The appearance is the emptiness, and the emptiness allows the appearance. You cannot have one without the other.
But this introduces a new, highly insidious danger.
Yes, it does.
What happens if we take this beautiful, elegant philosophical framework of the two truths and we mistakenly treat it as a new religion?
Which happens constantly.
What if we start worshiping emptiness as the ultimate solid reality? What if I start thinking, my desk isn't real, but emptiness is the real solid truth of the universe.
Our desire to grasp onto a solid foundation is so relentless that even when we are handed the cure for grasping, we will try to grasp the cure itself.
It's ironic.
It is.
Ah.
If you reify emptiness, if you turn emptiness into a new, absolute, independent truth that you can hold on to for comfort, the cure simply becomes a new poison.
You're right back where you started.
Exactly. Suffering from the disease of reification, just armed with a more sophisticated spiritual vocabulary. You have traded an iron chain for a gold chain, but you are still chained.
To prevent this, to stop us from turning his philosophy into a new dogmatic religion, Nāgārjuna forces us to run his diagnostic logic on the cure itself.
We are now going to execute a rigorous 11-step analysis of the two truths framework.
We're going to prove the emptiness of emptiness.
Let's start with step 1. We identify the 3 spheres of our philosophical model, taking the framework we just learned and turning it into a triad.
Okay, so we map the philosophy itself onto the diagnostic table.
Yes. Sphere 1 is the first truth, dependent origination. That's the functional, conventional world of cause and effect.
Got it.
Sphere 3 is the second truth, emptiness, the ultimate lack of inherent essence.
And sphere 2 is the relation between them.
The interaction, the union, or the opposition between these two truths. That's step 1.
Having identified the spheres, for step 2, we now drop them through the tetralemma.
The fourfold logic gate.
Yeah, this is an ancient Indian logical tool used to exhaust all possible relationships between two concepts, right?
That's right. We have to rigorously test these two truths to prove they cannot be different, identical, both, or neither.
Let's walk through the inescapable corners of this trap. I'll play devil's advocate here. Right. Let's look at corner number 1. Are the two truths identical?
Are dependent origination and emptiness the exact same inherent thing?
My instinct says yes, because there is only one universe. There aren't two separate realities stacked on top of each other, so shouldn't they be identical?
If we accept that they are absolutely identical, we face an immediate logical disaster in our daily lives.
How so?
If the conventional functional world of causes and effects is absolutely identical to the ultimate truth of emptiness, then the conventional world instantly collapses.
Think about a glass of water.
Yeah.
Conventionally, it holds liquid. Ultimately, it is empty of a permanent glass essence. If those two truths are identical, then dropping the glass shouldn't shatter it, because emptiness cannot shatter.
Exactly. Emptiness has no form. Furthermore, the very concepts of navigating a functional world, of practicing a philosophy, of seeking liberation from suffering become completely redundant.
Oh, because if the illness of ignorance and the cure of wisdom are mathematically identical, there is no healing process. There is no path.
Right.
I see. If they are identical, my desk loses its ability to hold my coffee cup. Okay, so they cannot be identical. Let's pivot to corner number 2. Are they inherently different?
Are they completely separate realities?
Yeah, if emptiness is the ultimate pristine truth of the cosmos, shouldn't it be fundamentally separate from my messy, chaotic, everyday world of traffic jams and broken coffee cups?
It's a tempting thought to place the ultimate truth on a higher, protected pedestal. But if they are totally separate, we break the mechanism of the universe.
Break it how?
If the conventional world is separated by a solid, inherent wall from ultimate emptiness, then dependently arisen phenomena like you, me, or a tree could not be empty.
They would have to possess inherent solid existence.
And as we established with the seed and the sprout, if things possess inherent existence, they are frozen.
The universe would be completely incapable of change, interaction, or causality. A seed could never become a sprout if it wasn't empty.
Exactly. Therefore, the ultimate truth cannot be a separate reality from the conventional.
Okay, so they aren't identical and they aren't completely separate. Corner number 3. Are they both identical and different?
Like a quantum superposition.
Yeah, they're both at the same time depending on how you look at it.
That is a retreat into contradiction. Mixing two logical fallacies does not manufacture a truth.
So I can't just say they're both to get out of the trap.
No, you cannot claim that a shape is completely a square and completely a circle in the exact same sense at the exact same time. Saying they are both is just a failure of precision. It is cognitive dissonance masked as profundity.
Which leaves us with corner number 4. Are they neither identical nor different? Maybe we just need an entirely new category outside of human logic to describe their relationship.
To claim they are neither is a retreat into absolute nihilism and solipsism.
A denial of the entire framework of reality.
It essentially says that logic doesn't exist, human experience doesn't exist, and there is no conceptual ground whatsoever upon which we can even have this conversation.
It plunges us into an unworkable absurdity where words mean nothing.
Exactly.
So if all four doors of the tetralemma are locked, if the relationship between the functional world and the ultimate truth isn't identical, isn't different, isn't both, and isn't neither, what are we left with?
It feels like the entire framework of the two truths just shattered in our hands.
It really does. It feels like crashing the software we just installed.
But it didn't shatter. It revealed its own true nature, which leads us to step 3.
Step 3.
Because every single logical position leads to a contradiction, we must conclude that the two truths and their relationship are entirely empty of inherent existence.
Even the ultimate truth of emptiness is empty.
Yes, they are never absolute. They do not exist out there in a dead, objective universe as glowing Platonic ideals waiting to be discovered by a philosopher's telescope.
Yeah, because they are empty of inherent reality, we move to step 4. We have to conclude that these three spheres, the conventional truth, the ultimate truth, and the union between them, are inseparable.
Dependently co-originated, interdependent, co-emergent, co-evolving, and co-imputed by the mind.
Co-imputed by the mind is a vital mechanism to understand here. Emptiness and dependent origination are merely designations.
They are names. They are conventional tools that human beings invented to navigate our way out of the suffering caused by reification.
The map is not the territory. The blueprint of a house cannot protect you from the rain.
Exactly.
Let's use a modern mechanical analogy to explore this co-imputed interdependence, because I think it maps perfectly onto how we build virtual realities today.
Let's hear it.
Look at the architecture of a modern video game engine. You have three primary components. First, you have the rendering pipeline, which correlates to our perception.
Okay.
It's constantly drawing the lighting, the shadows, and the textures, but it only draws what the player's camera is actively looking at.
Right.
Second, you have the physics engine, which calculates gravity, momentum, and collision. That's motion. And finally, you have the core game logic, the background code of if-then statements. That's causality.
Makes perfect sense.
If I am playing the game, how do these systems actually interact behind the screen?
They rely entirely, 100%, on each other in a continuous, infinite feedback loop. The rendering system cannot draw the environment without asking the physics engine where the player's avatar is standing.
And the physics engine cannot calculate a collision without asking the game logic if an object is coded as solid stone or liquid water.
They are completely interdependent. If you pull a plug on just one of those systems, the entire game doesn't just degrade.
It instantly crashes to the desktop.
Exactly.
And if you dig into the actual code on the hard drive, if you search for the truth of the game, there is no inherent seed or dirt inside the computer's memory.
There is no physical sword.
There is only interdependent relational code continuously updating itself at 60 frames per second to project a stable illusion.
The two truths are simply the philosophical code describing the matrix of our biological reality.
But let's push that video game analogy until it breaks, because that is what Madhyamaka demands.
We have to. In a video game, you still have a hardware server, and you still have a human programmer who wrote the code.
Right.
But in Nāgārjuna's framework, there is no hidden server. There is no programmer. The interaction of the mind and the environment continuously writes the code as this is being executed.
Just as there is no physical dirt in the computer's memory, there is no inherently existing emptiness floating in the physical universe.
The two truths are the interdependent source code of our conceptual understanding, and they are written by our own cognition.
But this leaves us with a massive linguistic roadblock.
It does.
If the two truths depend entirely on each other, and they are just conceptual tools written by our own minds, how do we describe their ultimate relationship without falling back into the trap of using absolute language?
How do we talk about the code without pretending the code is magic?
Exactly.
This brings us to step 5. We must specifically note the union of the two truths about the two truths themselves.
Which requires a highly metacognitive leap.
A huge leap. We realize that the first truth-dependent origination is refuted as an absolute reality right at the start of our philosophical journey when we deconstruct causality.
And the second truth, emptiness, is refuted as an absolute reality later through the tetralemma we just walked through.
Yet they energize and imply each other perfectly.
It's the realization that the phrase dependent origination and emptiness is itself dependently arisen and empty.
It is a limitless, centerless fractal loop. The tool you use to dismantle reality is itself subject to being dismantled by the exact same tool.
It's like a snake eating its own tail forever, with no starting point and no ending point.
Which forces us into step 6. We conclude that the two truths and their union are like illusions.
Reflections, mirages, dreams, or echoes. They are functionally there, yet not there.
I know you have thoughts on the word illusion here.
I do. I have to admit, I always struggle with the word illusion in these texts. When I hear illusion, I think of a stage magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat.
Right, a parlor trick.
I think of a hallucination that doesn't matter, something I can just ignore. But the texts use the analogy of an echo, which I think carries much more functional weight.
Walk us through the echo.
If I am hiking in a massive canyon and I yell into the void, the echo functions perfectly in conventional reality. The sound waves bounce off the rock wall, they travel back to my ear.
It might even physically scare a flock of birds into the air.
Exactly. The echo has a real causal impact on the world. But if I try to reach out and physically grab the echo, my hand just closes on empty air.
It has no physical core.
It is dependently originated by my voice, the shape of the canyon, and the atmospheric pressure.
The echo is the perfect representation. It functions flawlessly, but it is empty of inherent substance.
Or consider the analogy of a reflection in a mirror.
Also a great one.
We use the conceptual framework of the two truths like a reflection in a mirror to comb our hair. The reflection is a highly functional tool. We use the philosophy to cure our ignorance and fix our perspective.
But you shouldn't smash the glass of the mirror to try and keep the reflection in your pocket.
You cannot hoard the two truths as absolute possessions.
But if our ultimate philosophical cure is just a functional echo, just a reflection in a mirror, how are we supposed to even think about it?
Because every single word I use implies a solid thing. The moment I say emptiness, my brain categorizes it as an object.
Language completely fails us here, which is why Nāgārjuna pushes us to step 7. We must transcend categorical thinking entirely. We utilize the generalized tetralemma.
The generalized tetralemma.
This is where we forcefully affirm that the two truths and their union are not this, they are not this, they are not both, and they are not neither. For whatever this happens to be.
Wait, for whatever this happens to be? That covers literally every thought, every concept, every noun and verb I could possibly conjure in my brain.
That is exactly the point. It is a total negation of our exhausting psychological need to categorize the universe.
So you cannot box reality into existent or non-existent.
Or dual or non-dual, permanent or impermanent. You must abandon the grid entirely.
And this leads to step 9, the ultimate attitude we must adopt toward reality, which is the middle way. The middle way is completely free from all extremes.
Yes, the middle way acts as the complementary antidote to the two great sicknesses of philosophy.
The extremes of eternalism and nihilism.
Right, it cures eternalism. The naive realism that thinks things last forever and have solid inherent cores. And it cures nihilism, the solipsistic idealism that thinks nothing exists, nothing matters, and actions have no consequences.
In the middle way, we do not accept or reject the two truths in absolute terms. There is absolutely nothing to add, seek, or affirm, and there is nothing to subtract or negate.
To make this tangible, let's use the analogy of riding a bicycle.
Oh, I like this one.
If you lean too far to the right into eternalism, you crash. If you lean too far to the left into nihilism, you crash.
So the middle way isn't just a frozen, rigid line painted on the ground that you perfectly adhere to.
Not at all. The middle way is the dynamic, continuous micro-adjustments you make while pedaling. You aren't frozen and you aren't falling. You are dynamically engaging with the gravity of the universe without being crushed by it.
A dynamic balance without a fixed center. And when you achieve that balance, you experience the most profound realization in the entire Madhyamaka system.
The equivalence of samsara and nirvana.
This absolutely broke my brain when I first grasped it. For anyone unfamiliar, samsara is the painful, ignorant cycle of suffering, birth, and death. It's the daily grind of anxiety.
And nirvana is total liberation, enlightenment, the ultimate goal of spiritual practice.
In almost every religious or philosophical tradition, we treat these as two completely different places. You climb a metaphorical ladder to escape the burning building of samsara, so you can relax in the cool paradise of nirvana.
But through the lens of the middle way, Nāgārjuna proves that there is zero physical or ontological difference between samsara and nirvana.
They are the exact same cyclical reality.
Because if nirvana was a separate, inherent place, it would violate the emptiness of all phenomena. There is no alternate dimension you escape to.
The universe does not physically change its molecular structure when you become enlightened.
Nirvana is simply samsara perceived with wisdom, free from the tinted glasses of grasping and reification.
Samsara is this exact world experienced with desperation, attachment, and the delusion of solid boundaries.
And nirvana is this exact same world experienced with the visceral knowledge of its empty, mirage-like nature. You don't escape the river, you just stop trying to freeze the river with your bare hands.
This sounds beautifully poetic in a quiet room while reading a book. But let's get ruthlessly practical.
Step 10.
Yes, step 10. How does the listener actually apply this breathtaking, centerless philosophy tomorrow morning when their alarm goes off? Because the alarm always goes off, bills have to be paid, and the world demands interaction.
This brings us to the practice of acting without acting. We conclude that we can use the two truths and all conventional reality as functional tools, but never in absolute terms.
We use them without attachment, without reification, and without effort or absolutes.
Exactly, fully knowing their true empty nature.
Acting without acting sounds like a paradox, though. It sounds like a prescription for apathy, where you just sit on the couch and let life happen to you because nothing is real anyway.
It's the exact opposite of apathy.
Let's apply this to a high-stakes scenario. Let's say I have a massive corporate meeting tomorrow that could determine the trajectory of my career.
Right.
Or I'm commuting to that meeting, and I get aggressively cut off in brutal gridlock traffic. If everything's an empty mirage, do I just not care about the meeting? Do I let the guy hit my car?
If you let the guy hit your car, you have fallen off the bicycle into nihilism. Acting without acting is the antidote to apathy. You still fully, passionately participate in the conventional world.
So for my corporate meeting, I still prepare intensely.
You build the presentation, you strategize, you engage completely in the negotiation, you respect the laws of dependent origination, because if you do not prepare, the causal conditions will inevitably result in failure.
And in traffic, I absolutely slam on my brakes to avoid a collision. The conventional reality functions, the echo bounces off the canyon wall, and I must respect it.
Exactly.
So what's the difference? Where is the actual liberation in that moment of stress?
The liberation is entirely in your psychological posture. While you engage fully, you completely strip away the suffocating, desperate attachment to an absolute outcome. In the meeting, you do not reify the label of winner into an absolute identity that defines your entire self-worth. You don't reify the contract into a permanent savior that will finally make you happy.
I play the game with intense focus, but I never, ever forget that it is a game constructed of empty conditions.
And in traffic, when you are cut off and your adrenaline spikes, you do not reify the other driver into an absolute villain with a solid essence of evil.
Nor do I reify myself as an absolute permanent victim.
You recognize the event as a temporary, chaotic clash of conditions: stress, distraction, physics, timing. You experience the biological adrenaline, but you do not build a permanent, suffocating narrative of anger around it.
You experience the event, and then you let it dissolve back into emptiness.
You engage deeply, but you wear the world lightly.
Let's look at the famous raft analogy from the ancient texts, because it perfectly synthesizes this conventional use.
It's a classic.
Imagine you were standing on the shore of a dangerous, turbulent river, which represents your own confusion, grasping, and anxiety. You build a heavy, complex wooden raft, which represents the intricate logic of the two truths we just discussed.
Right. You use the raft to cross the river. It is highly functional.
But once you finally reach the far shore of understanding, once you see the mirage for what it is, you do not heave that heavy wooden raft onto your back and carry it with you through the forest for the rest of your life.
You drop the philosophy, you drop the rigid concept.
You leave the raft on the shore and you walk freely.
And this forces the ultimate question. When you finally drop that raft, when you let go of the very concepts of dependent origination and emptiness, when you stop conceptually dividing the world into internal subjects and external objects, what is left of you and the universe?
That takes us to step 11, the absolute culmination of Madhyamaka, primordial equality and boundless compassion.
In this liberated view, stripped of all conceptual grasping, we perceive everything, including the two truths and their union, as primordially equal, pure, perfect, complete, divine, and one.
But we must be razor sharp with our definitions here. One, strictly in the non-dual sense, not many, not one, not both, not neither.
Yes.
I want to unpack the ultimate consequence of this fractal karmic cycle, because this is where the philosophy rewires your daily behavior. We've established that the perceiver and the perceived continually update and co-create each other.
It's an infinite feedback loop.
Think about a farmer. The farmer walks into an empty field and plants a seed. The farmer's action physically alters the landscape of the field.
Through dependent origination, the field yields a harvest.
That harvest is then consumed by the farmer, physically altering the farmer's neurochemistry, cellular structure, and caloric energy.
That altered neurochemistry then dictates the farmer's next action in the field.
The boundary completely dissolves. The inside becomes the outside, and the outside continuously becomes the inside.
Exactly. Because this loop is continuous and unbroken, happening at the speed of milliseconds throughout our entire lives, the border between the internal self and the external cosmos violently collapses.
There is no hard line where you end and the universe begins. You are not a discrete object. You are a highly permeable, temporary node in a vast overlapping cycle of conditions.
And this collapse of boundaries has a profound, inescapable ethical extrapolation. How does this interconnected physics generate compassion?
In the Madhyamaka framework, boundless compassion is not a polite moral convention.
No, it is not a societal rule or a commandment handed down from an absolute authority that you have to grit your teeth and obey.
It's the raw ontological physics of reality. If your inside becomes the outside and the collective environment instantly conditions your internal perception, then other people are not fundamentally inherently separate from you.
Their conditions are your conditions.
Intentionally hurting someone else, acting out of greed, malice, or selfishness, is causally injecting poison and suffering into the very environmental fractal that will instantaneously loop back to update your own perception.
Precisely. To inflict suffering on another is a logical absurdity when you realize there is no absolute other.
It is exactly like your left hand suddenly pulling your right hand out of a blazing fire.
Your left hand doesn't need to consult a moral philosophy textbook to decide to act. It acts instantaneously because the right hand is part of the exact same nervous system.
When you deeply perceive the centerless, interdependent fractal of reality, compassion is simply a spontaneous, logical reaction to the way things actually are.
So let's synthesize this massive journey we've just taken.
By meticulously proving the emptiness of emptiness, by running the rigorous diagnostic logic on the cure itself, Nāgārjuna performs the ultimate psychological surgical extraction.
He leaves absolutely nothing for our anxious minds to grasp as an absolute inherent ground, basis, or source of reality. Not causality, not motion, not perception, and not even the concept of emptiness itself.
He systematically removes every single conceptual floorboard beneath our feet. And the profound miracle is that instead of falling into terror and nihilism, we find that we don't need a floor.
We can simply rest. Resting in that ineffable suchness without grasping at the mirage, yet participating fully, skillfully, and compassionately in the dance of conventional reality.
That is total liberation. Thank you so much for surviving this intense reality-bending deep dive with us today. It takes genuine courage to let your fundamental assumptions about the universe be dismantled.
It really does.
But before you go, I want to offer you one final lingering puzzle to test this new paradigm as you step back into the flow of your day.
A parting thought.
We just spent all this time proving that every cause you identify, every destination you walk toward, and every truth you cling to is a mental imputation. They are conceptual buckets that your mind projects onto the rushing, centerless river of reality just to make sense of the noise.
So observe the machinery of your own mind right now.
Just watch it work. What exists in the silent, terrifying, unlabeled gaps between those thoughts? In the exact fraction of a microsecond before your mind imputes the next cause, the next destination, or the next perception. Who or what are you? Keep diving.